I'm in the Mason's Arms for today's masterclass, set in the corn market in the charming, historic market town of Louth, on the edge of the Lincolnshire Wolds. This handsome 300-year-old building is both bistro and bedrooms. My name's Jo Tomlinson, and today I will be presenting session 1 of 3 on raising finance and funding. The first thing that we're going to look at on raising finance and funding is knowing your numbers. You would be surprised how many people go to a funding establishment and they know that they need some funds to grow their business, but they don't know how much, they don't know how long they're going to need it for, they often don't have a detailed list of what they're going to spend it on, and they can't give evidence as to how they're going to be able to afford to pay it back. So the first thing you need to be thinking about is, are your numbers up to date? So how much funding do you need and how long do you need it for? And a bank, a commercial lender, is also going to want to know, can you afford the repayments and what you're going to spend it on? Now, to be able to answer these questions, the first thing that you're going to need to do is get up to date with all of your finances. So, have you filed the last set of accounts? Is your bookkeeping up to date? And then based on that, you're going to have to think about what it is that that funder wants from you. And often they're going to want those historic numbers, so they're going to want the accounts that have been filed and possibly management accounts up to last month. But they're also going to want forecasts. And we can't put forecasts together until we know our numbers. We've got to have the historic data before we can then project that forward. And the first piece of advice I would give to you when you're looking at funding is think about what your funder needs. So how much money are you wanting? If you're wanting a relatively small amount of money for a relatively short amount of time, then the chances are you're not going to need huge amounts of forecasting evidence to go with it. But if it's a substantial amount of money, then make sure that whoever it is who's looking at whether or not you're a good proposition has got all of the evidence that they need to support your access to finance. So they might need forecasts for profit and loss, they might need to have a look at your balance sheet, and they might need to look at your cash flow. But one way or another, you're going to need to look at your cash flow, because how do you know the answer to those questions of how much do you need and how long do you need it for? Because your cash flow forecast is going to give you the answer to those questions. So the first thing that you're going to need to do is get your numbers up to date. Make sure that you are keeping your bookkeeping up to date. So are you using software to do your bookkeeping? If you've got a piece of software, and there are loads of them out there, then you should be keeping that up to date on a regular basis. For me, ideally, I'd like you to be keeping your bookkeeping up to date on a weekly basis, or getting somebody to do that for you on a weekly basis. Because if you don't, how do you even know how well you're doing in your business? How do you know who owes you money and who you owe money to? So getting your bookkeeping up to date is really important just for you in running your business. But it's really important to any funder as well. So make sure that you're thinking about the frequency with which you update your bookkeeping, because it will allow you to have real-time information on your business, which any manager of a business should be wanting anyway. But it also means that you're less likely to forget what you actually spent that money on. Because if you come to your bank account and try to do the bookkeeping and it's 6 months, 18 months later for some people who might just do it once a year when their accounts are due, then you're unlikely to remember what it was you spent that on. And if you haven't got the receipt, you're also unlikely to be able to find it. So do keep up to date with that bookkeeping, because it's always important, but crucially important when you're looking for access to finance. So when we think about doing forecasting, we need to think about timescale and which forecast we're actually going to need. So think about how much money it is that you're going to need and how long you're going to need that money for, because that's going to help you to understand how much of a timescale you need to think about for your forecast. Because if it's a short-term requirement for funding, you don't really need to do a 5-year forecast. But if you're looking for a substantial amount of money and you're looking for it for a substantial amount of time, then your forecast needs to represent that. I probably wouldn't recommend looking at a timescale more than 5 years because it's really hard to know what's going to happen next year, never mind in 5 years' time. So we need to think about that timescale and which forecasts we're actually going to produce. So will it be profit and loss, balance sheet, cash flow? But surely we're going to need that cash flow to answer those questions that we had right at the beginning, which is how much do we need and how long do we need that for? Now, once we've got all our numbers up to date, we can then project those numbers forward as our base business. And we've got a fair idea of what next year's going to look like based on last year and any previous years, because we know how much we grow organically based on the business model that we've got. But once we start overlaying into that the funding that we've got and the growth that that will bring in, we're talking about new sources of revenue, new lines of income, new marketplaces. And we don't have a crystal ball. We don't necessarily know what that's going to provide. So we need to look at some assumptions. We need to say we think we're going to get 80% occupancy on 46 weeks of the year or whatever that's going to be. But we need to document whatever assumptions we're using in those forecasts to make sure that whoever it is that we're asking for funds from, when they look at that forecast, they can buy into those assumptions. And then we need to think about some scenarios, because what happens if we'd predicted 80% occupancy rate, but actually it's 60 or it's 100? What happens if there's another COVID? What happens if? We need to have some forecasting scenarios in place that are going to give us the confidence to know that this is going to work and that we're going to be able to afford to pay those funds back, but also our funder. So we need to think about scenarios and not just have one forecast going forward, especially when it's into new marketplaces and new income streams, because those assumptions, sometimes they might not be as accurate as we would want them to be. So any financial institution, any lender is going to want to know that the income streams generated from the funds that they provide are going to lead to them getting money back. You will only get funding if your loan risk is low. So you need to prove that your loan risk is low. So that's the end of session 1 of 3 on raising finance and funding. I hope you found the session interesting and useful.